Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. It's called Stop Chasing Alerts, Start Catching Attackers. I hope that wherever you are right now, you and your families are all safe and healthy. My name is Daniel Brody. I'm Product Marketing Director at Illusive Networks, and I will be the moderator today. Now, before I hand over the microphone to today's speaker, I wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and will be accessible at illusivenetworks.com. We'll email you a link after this session with the webinar on demand. And then we'd also love to hear from our viewers today during today's presentation. So if you have a question for the speaker, please feel free to send it along through the Q&A box on the Zoom player. You can also tweet at us at our Twitter handle. It is EllusiveNW, right, at EllusiveNW. And we'll answer questions at the end of the session. And if we don't have time to get to yours, we'll make sure to follow up with you individually afterwards. So without any further ado, let's kick things off. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Illusive Networks Field CTO, Wade Lance. Wade, how are you doing today?
Well, you know, Daniel, it's another day in paradise, right? I'm here in Houston. We're just living the dream. So thanks a bunch. Well, hello, everyone. And thank you for joining the session, or if you're looking at the session afterwards, we appreciate you taking the time to hear a message from Illusive. We're pretty excited about the capability, and in particular, this distinction of kind of, stop chasing our tails with being buried with alerts and moving towards just really actually catching the attackers. I'm the field CTO for Illusive Networks, and hey, let's go. So what we're going to cover in the session today, we're gonna take a look at kind of some of the methods that we've used traditionally, kind of how security has kind of played out as it's developed over the years, and how that works in today's environment. I will give a brief demo of the Illusive Platform, kind of how we're changing the game. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually put that into action, and how the adoption looks. And at the end, we'll take some of your questions. So feel free to send those into either Twitter or in the Zoom box. So one thing that we see very commonly is the world has changed and is changing, and that some of the traditional methods that we've been using to defend against attackers are not having the effect that they have had. Here's kind of an interesting, shift in user behavior. 70 million is the current estimate on telecommuters, people that, look, we know based on current conditions that work from home and remote users, that whole capability is just exploding right now. And this is a huge shift in user behavior. Here's another interesting one: 500% growth in the use of Microsoft Teams in China just since January. And these kind of, with the shift in behavior and detection systems really struggling with alerts, we see an opportunity to make some shifts in the security process and improve the capability for defenders. And this is really the unfortunate news, and how it lays out is, as defenders, we have to be right every time, right? And we've got a whole host of tools that we traditionally use, from endpoint capabilities and perimeter capabilities and log aggregation, behavioral analytics, to try and do a good job with both prevention and detection and response. And yet, the numbers still prove out that there is this asymmetrical advantage purely for the attacker, right? We have to get it right all the time. They only have to be right once. And really the question is, at Illusive, our mission is to flip this asymmetry so that it's in our favor, right? And that attackers are buried in difficulty, and that we're in a very strong position to detect and defend, and that when attacks do happen, they're detected and mitigated quickly. So the world kind of runs on credentials, and this is unfortunately a thing that we see all too often. As security teams, we do a lot of work in the space of creating policies, creating controls, and putting in enforcement of those capabilities. We also do, auditing, to the best that we can. But I love this image of this parking lot with this gate. Someone, put together a little RFID chip, and you have to have the right kind of a key code to get past the gate into this parking lot. And yet, a quick audit kind of exposes the reality that it's not working, right? The control is in place, and yet people find the easy path around. And so what we see is that computer networking really runs on credentials and connection strings also. And so once credentials have been compromised, the users and the attackers in a position to get access to things. And the real problem is they look like the user that they're pretending to be. So one shift that we see that can really change this asymmetry is moving beyond anomaly detection into distributed deception. And certainly with VPN and additional VDI and cloud-based interactions, anomaly detection, behavioral anomalies, a lot of the baselines that anomaly detection systems have kind of operated off of, you can kind of toss those out the window, in that user behavior has changed so dramatically and will continue to, both where people are connecting from, the times of day they're connecting from, just these base elements have shifted dramatically. And we and Gartner and a lot of other organizations have seen dramatic shifts by leveraging distributed deception. And so at Illusive, we're taking a holistic look at the attack surface and how to really create a hostile environment for the attackers. And so I've got here a simple diagram showing different hosts and different users and different connections. And what we do at Illusive is examine the environment and identify pathways that are kind of the bread and butter for attackers, right? Once an attacker gets a beachhead, the fundamental question is, for them, how can they leverage the credential and connection data that they find on that beachhead host in order to move against other systems in the environment and get at juicy, useful information or systems? And so we have a process to perpetually identify and simply remove those pathways. So here in the little diagram, the little yellow lines represent pathways that exist in the environment but are not useful to the business. They just represent opportunities for exploitation by an attacker. Now, once that hygiene has been done, what we notice is there are still leftovers, right? Networks function, systems function on the ability to communicate with each other, and these kind of interactions are just a part of the process. We can't clean it all. And so at Illusive, what we've done is use some sophisticated algorithms to tell a story as if there are more hosts and more interactions and more credentials that are available, more applications in the environment. And it's all automatically managed and maintained and generated, so that to an attacker who gains a beachhead, the environment now is the trap. And it looks as if there's a lot of opportunities to move laterally, but in fact, the majority of that information is deceptive. And so the last piece is, when that information is leveraged, the deceptive credential and connection data that we plant, when an attacker leverages that information to move in the environment, we detect that behavior and then respond to the source of the behavior, the production system where the attacker is operating, with real-time forensics collection directly off the source system. And all of this is done without an agent, which makes it extremely appealing in not just reducing overhead and just the number of agents that are operating on systems, but also an attacker's inability to interact with our platform to detect it and disable it. There's no agent. Makes it extremely difficult to avoid. So with that said, I'd like to jump over and just give you a quick look at the system itself. This is a look at the Illusive interface. And I'll draw your attention to the very first point of detail, and that this view is called attacker view. And the reason we call it attacker view is, at Illusive, we look at your environment not the way a defender does from kind of the traditional security defender perspective, but from the attacker's perspective. As an attacker, what would they see and what would they get at, were they to get a beachhead, and how do we work with that environment? So notice down here at the bottom, this is a real view. This is that real data from examining the systems. There are other views we'll look at later in the demonstration. But if I pick a particular host, this computer 72, and examine it, you'll notice a couple of things. These colored lines represent interactions with other systems. This computer 72 has done some SSH there in the yellow and some SMB, so Windows Share. Interesting mix on this particular system, those two protocols being prevalent. But nonetheless, what we're saying is that this system has interacted with these other systems in the environment. This one down here is a particular host. But what we're saying is that if an attacker lands on computer 72, they will find residue of interactions between this system and other systems where on computer 72 is this data. For all these systems, we find this history. This gorgeous fuchsia color here represents RDP. The red is web protocols, HTTP, HTTPS, and others. If they get access to one of these systems, they'll find this residue and they'll have a pretty good idea that if they want to move laterally, that's possible to do. And if they use the credential and connection data that they find, they should be able to do that without being detected because they'll be mimicking normal user behavior. So the question is, what can we do about it? So let's jump over here to Illusive Attack Surface Manager. And I'll just draw your attention to a couple of points. First of all, the overall risk to the organization, 81 out of 100, it's pretty high. The potential for an attacker to move without being detected is pretty high right now. We're gonna do something about that. Over here on the left, we can see various sections for attack surface rules, and these rules look at how our domain user credentials being managed in the environment, connections to crown jewel hosts and applications in the environment, local user administrators, a favorite of attackers, shadow administrators. And shadow administrators is a little unique. It's where the user themselves is not a member of a highly privileged group, and yet through Active Directory ACL, the user account has direct permissions assigned to that group, to that user account, such that they're able to be highly privileged in some capabilities. So the user is not a domain administrator as far as their group memberships go, but as an individual user, they've just been assigned those permissions through access control lists. We find this is very, very common. So shadow administrators, this idea of nested privileges, very difficult to see where these conditions exist. And let's look at what Illusive can expose and then actually do about this. So we look at primarily two facets. One is pathways to crown jewel systems, and this is a giant priority for us. We know that not all systems in the environment have the same priority and the same importance, and so we want to focus on the systems that are most sensitive and business critical. We also look at credentials, right? Access to privileged credentials. If as a bad guy I can get access to a privileged credential and I know the pathway to a sensitive host, I'm going to be very successful. Over here we see the top targets. Here's a domain controller in this environment. 22 different ways to interact with that system that just don't make any sense. That they seem to be a violation of security best practices. And so let's jump over and look at that, and we'll see how Illusive manages this kind of a situation. So here we see that domain controller, got a star on it. This is a crown jewel host. There are others in the environment. And you'll notice, again, this history of purple interactions were policy violations, which systems are violating security policy. And in this case, Notice that this system, this computer 2, we recognize that it has RDP. This fuchsia color represents a history of RDP interactions. Computer 2 has RDP into the domain controller. We're aware of that, but we don't really have a problem with it. The configuration seems to be acceptable. But here from computer 1, this is a highlighted interaction that, for any number of reasons, we think could be problematic. It could be a source-based behavior. Perhaps the user in the RDP client saved the credentials and the connection data, meaning that any attacker that lands on computer 1, all they have to know is just go open the RDP client and they're immediately able to access the domain controller with a highly privileged credential. If we pull this environment out, we can see that perhaps the source of the behavior came from another system. Perhaps computer 4 RDP'd into this host, and when they disconnected the RDP session, they left it running. So the session is still active. It's days old and stale. No one's using it. But in the memory of computer 1 lives a highly privileged credential that could be scraped from that system and used to move against another host. And these kind of problems build out through the network to create a web of interactions that attackers can leverage. And we see this all the time from post-breach investigation, as well as from red team exercises, where those organizations are very quickly able to get access to sensitive systems, and this is why. So at Illusive, what we have the ability to do is not just expose this information, but actually remediate it. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate a manual process to clean these policy violating configurations from the environment, as we discussed earlier. And what's happening is Illusive is reaching out to those systems, examining the configurations again, and just removing policy violations to reduce that overall attack risk in the environment and the attacker's opportunity to leverage credential and connection strings they find in the space. Now, we notice that amongst these production systems, there are still pathways between hosts. We simply can't clean it all. People have to be able to do their work. The next step in the process is to deploy deceptive information. Notice that this is happening automatically. Now, here in the demonstration environment, I clicked the button to make it happen so we could all kind of see it happen and see the results. But this happens continuously and automatically in the environment. Illusive is continuously cleaning and then continuously modifying the deceptive story to keep it fresh and interesting. So we see here that the overall attack risk is now dramatically reduced. And that as I look into the environment, all the systems in white are real production hosts. Everything in orange is a deceptive entity that has been planted. Or a history that has been created, so that if an attacker lands on computer 18 and they begin to look, sure enough, there is still one potential to move perhaps to another system. But 4 out of 5 of their options are deceptive history, and we can see this color-coded difference, but obviously the attacker cannot. And so what they see is this fresh, breathing, living, dynamic environment that matches user behavior. So, like for instance, right now I'm using a Chrome browser, but if I switched over to Opera and started using an Opera browser, Illusive would automatically identify that shift in my behavior and modify the deceptive environment in order to match that behavior on my system. It keeps the story real and fresh and effective in the environment. So the last thing we'll look at is the forensics data that we collect. Notice here that on this particular host, the user interacted with a deception. Their methods are SMB and RDP. This is the attacker's methods. Notice also they're 4 steps away from a crown jewel. Interesting behavior. If we drill into this information, in the time for the webinar today, we'll just do a quick touch on this, but we have detailed information about what the attacker is doing. We know their initial behavior. We see here that the attacker attempted to write out an executable on the admin share of this deceptive host. We've gathered a ton of information about how this attacker is operating in this space, up to and including The actual desktop screenshots, you can see here that this attacker is leveraging Mimikatz to do the credential scraping in the environment. So this kind of information makes it extremely consumable. So the real question is, what's the effect of a capability like this? And these are some of the numbers that we're seeing from our customers. Notice with traditional solutions, anomaly detection, per security system, they may be seeing 1,000 SOC alerts from an individual security platform, but with Illusive's distributed deception model, maybe 10 alerts in an entire month. We'll go through all of these. Notice that one way that we see dramatic shifts is both in incident response time going from hours to minutes, but also the exercise, to examine this capability, both red teams and detected attackers. Typically they're effective versus with the Illusive model, we're seeing consistent blue team wins over attackers and red teams in the environment as well. And so people get pretty excited about this level of shift. It really changes that asymmetry that we've seen that so heavily favored attackers in the environment. So kind of the new normal, here's some of the things that we're seeing contributing to the shifts in behavior, kind of how to leverage our capability in the new normal. So nonlinear increase in attacks. We're seeing dramatic spikes in some kinds of attacks. That stuff's easily available on our website, but there's definitely people looking to exploit these shifts in behavior. The attack surface is very volatile and shifting constantly. Users interacting at different times from different locations, different durations, new kinds of users, certain kinds of users and kinds of credentials that were typically only used in the enterprise are now being used off network. Lots of SOC false positives continue to increase based on anomaly detection systems struggling. Frustrated users in case, insiders continue to grow in environments like this. And so when you deploy an Illusive solution, the process looks pretty much like this. The first thing we do in many cases is a risk assessment to where is the organization at as far as credentials and connection strings, what kind of attacker opportunity exists today in the environment. And once we have that understanding, we're in a position to implement Illusive attack surface management and just simply reduce that opportunity for attackers and insiders. They have a huge advantage when credentials and connection strings aren't managed well, because we give them access to our environments. They work, in our organization. So insiders definitely have a leg up. But by reducing that attack surface, we really eliminate a lot of pain in the SOC and alert levels and improve our position. But implementing our attack detection and intelligence systems with the deceptive planting and the automated forensics now gives us ability to detect insiders and malicious actors with beachheads very early in the attack cycle, right? The first beachhead that they've got. And this really gives us the whole process, maybe 30 days from start to fully implemented. A single Illusive system can manage up to 150,000 endpoints. It's very light in the environment. And so we had just really super response about this shift and the ease, and because of the automation, about a half of an FTE for 100,000 systems being managed. It's a very easy system to manage and support. And so I've got a little information about Illusive up on the screen, kind of some of our customers and partners and awards that we've earned in this space. But we appreciate your time today and the opportunity to tell our story. I know that we've got some questions, and certainly wanted to leave a couple of minutes for that. So, Daniel, if you wanna fire away, I think we got time for at least a couple of questions. And if we don't get to your questions today, we'll definitely reach out after the webinar and get those answered after the session.
Yeah, Wade, thank you. There are a couple questions here, so let's just dive in. And if you still have a question, you can type it in the box. There's still time. So the first question that comes up is talking about the integrations. What kinds of technologies does Illusive integrate with?
Great question. So there's a whole series of platforms we integrate with. Obviously, LDAP, and Active Directory in order to understand the credential space that we're dealing with and do ACL analysis. We work with EDR platforms. This gives us ability to implement quarantine. We work with SIM platforms to do alerting, be a good member of the security community. We have integrations with privilege account management systems, so we understand how the credential platforms are being used, DNS systems, and so there's a broad series of integrations. We really feel like being a fully integrated platform into the tools you already have is essential to being effective, and so we can get you a full list of the integrations again after the session.
All right, great. So the next question is, what happens when a regular employee comes across the deceptions you plant? And I assume that's not when the regular employee is not being a malicious insider, right?
Absolutely. So this has been one of the things that has tripped up, I think, deception efforts in the past, is that the method that we're talking about here is breadcrumbing, where we leave behind deceptive data, credential and connection strings on the production systems. Well, there's users on those systems, right? And so one of the things that Illusive is focused on very heavily is making sure that the deceptive data that we plant is really generally not accessible to the normal user. Fundamentally, the user has to violate policy to get at this information. And so we know that they violated policy to, say, find a credential. Maybe the user ran Windows credential editor in order to scrape a hash credential out of Windows memory. This is a policy violation in almost every network. The second piece of the puzzle, though, is that because we're not running an agent, the user has to then actually use that deceptive data in order for us to detect and respond. So first of all, the normal user has to violate policy to find our information, and then they actually have to try to use that information to get to another system. That's when we do the detection. So we're a very low noise, very high fidelity system because of that. And if a normal user has gone through those processes, they're probably working on a couple of fronts. So yeah, great question.
All right, and let's see. I think we got time for one more. So let me get this one. How does the forensic information that you get from the deceptions compare to what you would get from a honeypot when it comes to attacker behavior?
Oh, that's a great question. So, we have deceptive entities, on the network, different systems that detect connection events and look for scanners and all that kind of stuff. All the traditional, deceptive capabilities from the network perspective. We have all that, and we provide that information. However, what Illusive does that's particularly valuable is that we focus on getting forensic data directly from the source system, from the workstation or server that the attacker is leveraging, the production system. And what's so valuable about this is that we get to see the attacker in their natural environment, the tools that they're using, their exploitation methods. One of the difficult things about a honeypot is I've got to get an attacker to believe that it's real and then stay long enough to do some interactions. And we've found it's so much more effective to gather forensics information directly from the production system. And this gives us a huge advantage of seeing the attacker in their normal environment. This also helps us to very quickly determine, is this an automated method or the user? Or is this malware, or is this the user? And again, this is where the simplicity of our data makes it very consumable by an entry-level operator in the SOC, and people get pretty excited about. As a matter of fact, our forensics information is so interesting and lightweight to collect. The user is completely unaware that we're doing this. A lot of our customers actually leverage our forensics and data collection when their other security tools throw an alert about a user's practice, and they want elusive style forensics off the source of machine. Very, very interesting, very compelling capability. So great question.
All right, so it looks like we've covered most of our questions. However, if we didn't get to your question, we'll be sure to contact you after the webinar and get you an answer. Thanks, Wade, very much for your presentation today, and also thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to email you a copy of the session afterwards, and our series of webinars on the new normal continues next week on April 9th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, with Scenes from the New Normal, Cybersecurity in Uncertain Times, which will be a panel discussion with our founder and CEO, Ofer Israeli, a banking CISO, and a SANS Institute analyst about how the massive shift to work from home is affecting cybersecurity. It should be a very interesting discussion. Everyone will be coming live from their houses, so that should be interesting as well. So everyone, please tune in next week. Please stay safe, and we'll see you then. Have a good one.